Welcome to Chapter 8 in Beyond Feelings, our critical thinking book. So, this is really part 2 of the book, and it focuses on the errors that impair our thinking. So, in this chapter, we're going to learn to discover these errors that impair our thinking, and we're going to be able to discover errors in other people's writing and speaking, and then, of course, in our own writing and speaking. So, there's 5 basic errors. There's the mine is better error. And then there are errors of perspective, errors of procedure, errors of expression, and errors of reaction. So in part 2 of the book, we'll be focusing on all of these different types of errors, but we're going to start this chapter with the mine is better error. So the basic problem that we have when it comes to having accurate and honest thinking all of the time is this error called the mine is better error, or the mine is better perspective, which is the natural tendency to like our possessions better than other people's. And this is because we see our things as an extension of ourselves. When we get older, we stop saying our things are better like we did when we were kids. When we were kids, we just kind of blatantly would say, my dad's better than your dad, or my bike's better than your bike. But as we get older, we know that that's not appropriate socially. But we still think that our things are better, even though we're not verbally saying it. So this error is as old as humanity, and there are countless examples of it in history. People thinking that their religion is better than other people's, their country is better than other people's. It's led to wars and all kinds of conflict. In fact, psychologists surveyed high school seniors and asked if they considered themselves above average. No additional details or context, just do you consider yourself above average? And 70% of the high school seniors said that they did, which is obviously a mathematical impossibility. But we tend to think of ourselves as being above average, better than other people in different types of ways, especially when it comes to our things and our possessions. So most people generally have the understanding that we all feel like we are special. And when people have this understanding and are self-confident, they can usually control the tendency. The problem is when people don't understand that we all feel special and think that they are the only ones. And when they kind of adopt this attitude, we see that they are either falling into a category of egocentric people or ethnocentric people, or perhaps both. The term egocentric is defined as being centered or focused on oneself and interested only in one's own interests, needs, and views. And one telltale sign of an egocentric person is if they practice what's called ego speak. So ego speak is boosting our own egos by only talking about what we want and not caring what anyone else wants to talk about. So when you're engaging in ego speak, you're kind of always steering the conversation to be about yourself or to be about what you want to talk about. You're disregarding what other people want to talk about. You might be interrupting them. And both egocentrism and ego speak come from something called ego think. And ego think is just the egocentric person's habit of mind. So kind of always thinking about themselves, a sort of self-absorption. Obviously, when we are consumed by our own thoughts, we lack the ability to consider the world from various viewpoints. So people that are egocentric kind of think that the world is here for them and is defined by their beliefs and their values. And so then what disturbs them should disturb everyone. What doesn't matter to them shouldn't matter to anyone. And this attitude makes it really hard for them to observe, to listen, or to understand. It makes it hard for them to be a critical thinker because they can't see beyond their own perspective. It also makes resolution of issues with these people difficult. They only see some of the facts, specifically only the facts that have to do with them or are of interest to them. So another form of this mine is better perspective that's sort of a great error or is out of control, so to speak, is ethnocentrism. And so ethnocentric people are excessively centered or focused on their own group. It doesn't mean that we are ethnocentric if we identify with our ethnic group, our culture, or our religion, or even if we prefer their company. It's a problem if we are excessively centered or focused on that group. And also, ethnocentric people believe that their group is fundamentally and completely superior to other groups. They also believe that the motivations and intentions of other groups is suspect. And these beliefs make it hard to be a critical thinker. They question everyone's beliefs but the beliefs of their own group. They tend to respond to complex situations with oversimplifications because everything should be the way that fits with their group's point of view. They tend to form negative stereotypes of other groups because it makes life easier to just reject entire groups of people. So this also allows them to not have to deal with opposing viewpoints, and they always have a target. They can blame the outgroup for all societal problems. So like everything, there are extremists when it comes to the mine is better attitude, but most of us fall somewhere on a continuum, and usually that somewhere is in the middle. But our preferences can prevent us from identifying flaws in our own ideas, and our preferences can prevent us from seeing and building on other people's ideas. When we have this mine is better attitude, it creates a willingness to uncritically accept ideas that match our own, which ultimately leaves us open to manipulation by people within our group. So, mine is better thinking is the most basic problem for critical thinkers. If we don't control it, it distorts perception and corrupts our judgment, which really leaves us unable to be objective in our thinking. And so, what we can do is keep it in check by knowing that we are subject to it, we're not impervious from it, and that the more we care about something, the stronger the chance for this error. We need to be alert for signals that we're about to err. So we can look for those signals, those red flags in our feelings. So if something feels good, then we're going to have the desire to accept it immediately without evaluation. And if something feels bad, then we are going to have the desire to reject it immediately. But this is not critical thinking, so we need to pay attention to those red flags when something feels really good or something feels really bad. In terms of our thoughts, we're more likely to err if we say things like, well, an expert said that fact and I always thought that. Or this challenge is what I've always thought, so it's not true. So just because something goes against a belief that you've always had or something coincides with a belief that you've always had, we're more likely to go along with it because it's our belief. It matches our belief, and that feels good to our ego, and we like that. If it doesn't match our belief, then that doesn't feel good to our ego, and we don't like that. But this is an error in thinking or a red flag for a potential error, so we have to watch out for that. And this error doesn't mean that your idea is never better or that your stuff is never better than anyone else. It just means that evaluation becomes difficult if we always start from this position, if we always start with the mine is better error. So whenever you are about to commit this way of thinking, resist the temptation to react. Be patient. Allow time for evaluation. And consider all arguments fair-mindedly, which is not easily. Naturally, we will want to commit this error, but we have to be strong-minded and resist that urge in order to be a successful critical thinker. Alright, so for lecture activity 1, I'd like for you to give me an example of a time where you've committed this mine is better error. So you can give me the example in a minimum of 2 to 3 sentences, but it could be, of course, as long as it takes to comprehensively explain the example. So that is what I'm looking for lecture activity 1. Alright, so chapter 9 is going to take us through the errors of perspective. So let's dive right in and take a look at what those are. Errors of perspective are like wearing glasses with serious distortions in the lenses, smudges, scratches, but not knowing that those things are on your lenses. So errors of perspective shape the way you evaluate issues, they create expectations, and they bias your thought patterns before you even enter into an argument. So you may not even be aware that you are making this error. This error comes from our life experiences, things that we've been told and taught over time. All of our experiences shape our perspective, but our perspective can be limiting. So there are 7 specific errors of perspective that we're going to go through in this chapter. They include poverty of aspect, unwarranted assumption, the either-or outlook, mindless conformity, absolutism, relativism, and bias for or against change. So let's start going through them one at a time. So, poverty of aspect is the limitation that comes from taking a narrow perspective rather than a broad view on problems and issues. So, poverty of aspect is synonymous with tunnel vision, and I'll give you examples, or an example. One time I was at Olive Garden with my mom, and there was a gentleman sitting alone at the table next to us, and he appeared to be talking to himself. Since I am a psychologist, I'm always kind of thinking about psychology and talking about psychology, and that really shapes my perspective on the world or puts me in this tunnel, so to speak. So when I saw him talking to himself, I quickly concluded, being a psychologist, that he must be schizophrenic or have some mental illness where he is hallucinating that someone else is there with him and he was talking to that hallucination or the voices in his head or whatever mental illness he had. However, when he stood up, I saw that he had a Bluetooth headset on, so he was actually on the phone with someone and wasn't mentally ill at all. However, I erred in my thinking because I have this poverty of aspect. I'm always thinking about psychology. I'm always talking about psychology. So it kind of influences the way I think in that I quickly look to solve problems or explain things in terms of psychology. Which really kind of shuts me off to other possibilities. So, causes of poverty of aspect include intellectual laziness. The multiplication of academic disciplines over time has caused people to specify in certain areas rather than to kind of have a greater breadth, so to speak, just like in the example I gave. And then the recent increase in knowledge in all fields also kind of creates this issue where people are becoming experts in these fields and they're able to learn more about the specific field and get deeper and deeper into it. However, this can cause us to forget about the insights of other disciplines and other fields. So, poverty of aspect creates problems in analysis of complex issues. Because the answer to problems usually is a combination of factors. But if you're like me and you're only looking at it from the psychology perspective, then you're not really paying attention to other explanations and you're not open to them. So, regardless of if you are an expert in a field or not, you need to recognize that your expertise or experience is limited. Discipline your mind to broaden its outlook beyond the familiar and examine all relevant points of view. We need to understand before we can judge. So, the next area of perspective that we will be discussing is unwarranted assumptions. And to help exemplify this concept, I would like for you to get out a scratch piece of paper. And if you look at the screen here, you can see on the slide that there is a square in the upper right hand corner with nine dots in it. So draw on a scratch piece of paper the 9 dots just as you see them there on your screen. And then what I would like for you to do is draw 4 straight lines so that they pass through all 9 dots. Don't lift your pen or pencil as you're doing this, and don't touch any dot more than once. So you can go ahead and pause the video now and give that a shot. So again, you're going to draw 4 straight lines so they pass through all 9 dots. Don't lift your pen or pencil and do not touch any dot more than once. So go ahead and pause the video and give that a shot. Okay, so here is the correct answer to that puzzle. And basically the trick is that you have to go outside of the lines in order to solve it. However, many of us probably assumed that we had to stay within the lines because we've been taught that since we're in kindergarten, right? To stay within the lines when you're coloring or drawing. And so in this case, that would be an unwarranted assumption that caused us to not be able to solve this puzzle. And that's the inherent problem with unwarranted assumptions. So not all assumptions are bad, right? Like you assumed that there would be assignments due this week for class, so you logged in and you are completing those assignments. Had you assumed that like, oh, it's hot outside today, probably professor fell, didn't post the assignments. That would be not a good assumption. That would be an unwarranted assumption. There's nothing for you to base that assumption upon. So assumptions are ideas that are taken for granted rather than produced by conscious thought. And like I'm saying, they're not all bad. If you had to ponder every step you make in a day before making it, you wouldn't get a lot accomplished. So we do have to make some assumptions. They become a problem when they are unwarranted, when you take too much for granted. Oh, it's a hot day. She probably didn't post the assignments. Like, where are you getting that from? That's taking too much for granted. So I'll show you a quick clip now that should kind of illustrate unwarranted assumptions.
That was too much.
Let me go through this. You know what I'm saying, yo? All right.
Yo, just do that, man.
That's your piece.
Can I,
No, man, just get a bag of chips. Ah, see? I knew you had something back there.
For every kid that carries a gun, there are thousands that don't.
Later, man.
tomorrow?
Let's not forget that. Peace, live it or rest in it.
All right, so some of the most common unwarranted assumptions made by people are the assumption that people's senses are always trustworthy. For example, like if I see it, then it definitely happened. However, we can, like we talked about, our memories and perception are not perfect. So we can see things incorrectly, we can hear things incorrectly. The assumption that if an idea is widely reported, it must be true. So if everyone's saying something, then it must be true is an error. The assumption that having reasons proves that we have reason logically. So just because you have reasons for your beliefs doesn't make your belief a logical belief. You have to have reasons that are based on evidence and are developed through logic and are rational. And the assumption that familiar ideas are more valid than unfamiliar ones. So if you've ever caught yourself saying, well, I've never heard that before, as if just because you haven't heard about it makes it untrue, that would be an error. The assumption that if one event follows another in time, it must have been caused by the other. So if I see a black cat and then I fall down the stairs, I must have fallen down the stairs because I saw the black cat. That would be an error. The assumption that the majority view is the correct view, thinking, well, it has to be true if everyone's doing it or if everyone's thinking it. Everyone wouldn't be feeling the same way if it was incorrect. But for a long time, everyone thought the world was flat, and that wasn't true. The assumption that the way things are is the way they should be, kind of that old adage, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And sometimes things need fixing, even if they're not broken. Maybe they just need to be improved upon or kind of tweaked to be better than how they are currently. And the assumption that change is always for the better is another error, because sometimes the way things are really is the best way that they should be, and change might actually cause a situation to be worse. The assumption that appearances are trustworthy. So Ted Bundy, for example, right? Just because someone is attractive doesn't mean that they're trustworthy. Ted Bundy was a serial killer. The assumption that if an idea is in our mind, it is our own idea and deserves to be defended. But just because it is your idea, if you find out along the way that your idea is false or incorrect, you shouldn't defend it. You should be open to changing your mind or re-examining your position. The assumption that the stronger our conviction about an idea, the more valid the idea. So if you've ever caught yourself saying, like, but I really feel that this is true, just because you feel very strongly about something doesn't mean that that thing is true or accurate. And then finally, the assumption that if we find an error in someone's argument, we have disproved the argument. So people can have lots of different premises within their argument, and 99% of them can be true. If they get one argument or one premise in their argument incorrect, it doesn't make their whole entire argument incorrect. It just makes that premise incorrect. So these are the most common unwarranted assumptions. For lecture activity 2, I would like for you to give me an example of a time that you or someone you know committed one of these common unwarranted assumptions, and it caused error in your thinking. So if you could respond to that in 2 to 3 sentences at a minimum, that'd be great. So give me an example of a time you or someone you know committed one of these common unwarranted assumptions for lecture activity 2. Okay, so the next area of perspective is the either-or outlook, and this is the expectation that the only reasonable view of an issue is either total affirmation or total rejection. And this error kind of implies that everything is black or white, that there's no gray area. But the problem is that this outlook rejects the possibility that the answer could be both or and. So let me give you some examples of the either-or outlook.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
I'm the only good one.
Do you think you and Mommy did a good job raising me?
Of course we did.
Well, then you obviously taught me right from wrong.
True.
And you should trust me to do the right thing.
Wait.
Or you're a bad father. Take your pick.
Man, you're good.
So whenever you find yourself considering only 2 options, ask yourself if there could be another option and then consider it. So we're all conforming all the time. Conformity is kind of required for society to function, right? We all conform when we wear clothes in public or when we drive on the right side of the road instead of the left side of the road. But this creates some order, some law, some regulations, which allow for safety in a society. So conformity to a certain extent is often the wisest course of action and makes life safer and easier. Even when it comes to imitating people or kind of conforming to the way people are acting, especially if you're imitating a good positive role model, this is not a bad thing. It's also a form of conformity, but that can be something that is a kind of good thing for you to do, is look up to someone and then behave in a way that is congruent with their behavior if it's a positive, uplifting, healthy type of behavior. However, there is an error called mindless conformity, and this is conformity that is unreasonable and or unreasoning. So if we follow others' examples because we are too lazy or too fearful to think for ourselves, this is a problem. Many advertisers actually encourage mindless conformity, right? Like Nike comes to mind. Just do it. Kind of, if there's a product that's being advertised, the idea that's being implied is like, just buy this now, just get this thing now, don't think too much about it. These Doritos are fun, and the commercial is funny, and everything is light and happy. Don't think about what exactly that orange powder on the Dorito is. Just get it and eat it. The groups that we belong to can also encourage us to conform, sort of in a peer pressure type of way. So to resist mindless conformity, we need to resist whatever pleading, teasing, or prodding other people might do to try to get us to conform. We don't want to just give in. We want to always ask ourselves what is reasonable and right. And we want to follow the right path regardless of if it puts us in the minority or the majority. So there was a psychologist by the name of Solomon Asch that did these really interesting conformity experiments. So I'm going to show you one now. It's his line length experiment, and it really illustrates how easy it is to get people to conform, and in this case, kind of mindlessly.
But an experiment is not a public opinion poll. It examines behavior under the pressure of social forces, as the experiment of Solomon Asch reveals.
The experiment you'll be taking part in today involves the perception of lengths of lines. As you can see here, I have a number of cards, and on each card there are several lines. Your task is a very simple one. You're to look at the line on the left and determine which of the 3 lines on the right is equal to it in length. All right, we'll proceed in this order. You'll give your answer.
Only one of the people in the group is a real subject, the 5th person with the white t-shirt. The others are confederates of the experimenter and have been told to give wrong answers on some of the trials. The experiment begins uneventfully as subjects give their judgments.
2.
2.
2.
2.
2. 3.
3. 3. 3.
But on the 3rd trial, something happens.
2.
2. 2.
2. 2.
The subject denies the evidence of his own eyes and yields to group influence.
1.
Ash found subjects went along with the group on 37% of the critical trials. But he found through interviews that they went along with the group for different reasons.
1.
1. They must be right. There are 4 of them and 1 of me.
1.
This subject's yielding is based on a distortion of his judgment. He genuinely believes that the group is correct.
1.
1.
1.
2.
1. 2. 2.
2.
I know they're wrong, but why should I make waves?
2.
In this case, the subject knows he is right, but goes along to avoid the discomfort of disagreeing with the group. Here, the distortion is at the level of his response.
2.
2.
2.
2.
In the previous experiment, the naive subject stood alone against the group. In this variation, Ash gave the naive subject a partner, here seated in the 3rd position, who also gives the correct response.
1.
1. 2.
1. 2.
With a partner, yielding drops to only 5% of the critical trials compared to 37% without a partner. Although subjects report warmth and good feeling toward the partner, they typically deny that he played a role in their own independence. The partnership variation shows that much of the power of the group came not merely from its numbers, but from the unanimity of its opposition. When that unanimity is punctured, the group's power is greatly reduced. Sometimes we go along with a group because what they say convinces us they are right. This is called informational conformity. But sometimes we conform because we are apprehensive that the group will disapprove if we are deviant. This is called normative conformity. The strength of the normative factor is shown in another variation carried out by Ash. In this variation, the subject is told that because he had arrived late, he would have to write his answers. Subjects in this private response experiment are exposed to the same amount of misleading information as other subjects, but they are immune from any possible criticism by the group.
1.
1. 1.
And this enormously reduces the pressure to conform. Conformity drops by 2/3. Ash's experiment is a classic. It reveals how people will deny what they see and submit to group pressure. It allows us not only to observe conformity, but to study the conditions that increase or reduce its occurrence.
All right, for lecture activity 3, I would like for you to tell me if you were in Solomon Ash's line length experiment like you just saw in the video clip, would you have conformed as the people did, or would you have said, no, that's not the line that's the same length as the comparison line? So tell me if you think you would have conformed, and then after you give me an answer to that, tell me why you chose the answer that you chose. Why do you think you would conform, or why do you think you would not conform for lecture activity 3? So 2 to 3 sentences at a minimum. So the next error is absolutism, which is the belief that there must be rules but no exceptions, and it expects the truth about issues to be clear-cut, certain, and simple. But reality is often more ambiguous, less certain, and complex. For example, you might have heard this before, thou shalt not kill, right? But can you think of any exceptions to this commandment? Can you think of any times where our society or our culture says that it actually is acceptable to kill somebody? Like in war, or the death penalty, or if someone breaks into your house and you're defending yourself, or if you're an animal for food, then our society says there are exceptions to those thou shalt not kill rules. And so this illustrates the idea that just because there are rules doesn't mean that there are never any exceptions. So when you think in terms of absolutes, this creates unreasonable expectations and can cause you to be impatient in your thinking, which can then cause you to make oversimplified or hasty conclusions. People that are absolutists often hold strong to their beliefs and are unwilling to consider alternatives. And many people are vulnerable to errors and reluctant to change their minds. However, absolutists are more vulnerable because of their aversion to exceptions. So many people believe in absolutes but are not absolutists because they do at least consider the idea that there can be exceptions. So ways that people can overcome absolutism is to be willing to examine any issue, even ones you've thought of before, and commit to accept the truth, even if it's not as neat and simple as you would like. So here is a clip on absolutism.
Moral absolutism. Moral absolutism asserts that there are certain universal moral principles by which all people's actions may be judged. It is a form of deontology. The challenge with moral absolutism, however, is that there will always be strong disagreements about which moral principles are correct and which are incorrect. For example, most people around the world probably accept the idea that we should treat others as we wish to be treated ourselves. But beyond that, people from different countries likely hold varying views about everything, from the morality of abortion and capital punishment to nepotism and bribery. Moral absolutism contrasts with moral relativism, which denies that there are absolute moral values. It also differs from moral pluralism, which urges tolerance of others' moral principles without concluding that all views are equally valid. So, while moral absolutism declares a universal set of moral values, in reality, moral principles vary greatly among nations, cultures, and religions.
So the opposite of absolutism is relativism, and this is the belief that the existence of exceptions proves that there can be no rules. But this belief is really that truth is created and not discovered. If you are a person that engages in relativistic thinking, then you probably also think that what's true for you may not be true for me, or that's your truth and I have my own truth. And we've already talked about how those ideas are inadequate. People that believe in relativism find morality to be more subjective than objective. And so they kind of think, if I think this behavior is morally acceptable, then it is. But obviously that's not appropriate, because there is the serial killer who might feel justified in murdering people and think that it's morally acceptable. But we can't have that in a society. Obviously we need rules. So relativists find critical thinking pointless because in their opinion nothing can be false or incorrect. Relativists find ethics pointless because in their opinion if a person thinks their behavior is okay, then it is. And relativists find law process pointless because in their opinion choosing to do something is justification for doing it. And finally, relativists can't challenge anything or they are contradicting themselves. So to overcome relativism, remind yourself that some ideas and behaviors are actually better than others. So here's a clip on relativism.
Moral relativism. Moral relativism is the idea that there is no universal or absolute set of moral principles. It's a version of morality that advocates to each her own, and those who follow it often say, "Who am I to judge?" Moral relativism can be understood in several ways. Descriptive moral relativism, also known as cultural relativism, says that moral standards are culturally defined, which is generally true. Indeed, there may be a few values that seem nearly universal, such as honesty and respect. But many differences appear across cultures when people evaluate moral standards around the world. Metaethical moral relativism states that there are no objective grounds for preferring the moral values of one culture over another. Societies make their moral choices based on their unique beliefs, customs, and practices. And in fact, people tend to believe that the right moral values are the values that exist in their own culture. Normative moral relativism is the idea that all societies should accept each other's differing moral values, given that there are no universal moral principles. Most philosophers disagree, however. For example, just because bribery is okay in some cultures doesn't mean that other cultures cannot rightfully condemn it. Moral relativism is on the opposite end of the continuum from moral absolutism, which says that there is always one right answer to any ethical question. Indeed, those who adhere to moral relativism would say, "When in Rome, do as the Romans do."
Alright, for lecture activity 4, I'd like for you to provide an example of a time you, someone you know, someone in the media, pop culture, just give me an example of a time when someone was either committing this error of absolutism or committing the error of relativism. You don't need to give me an example for both, just give me an example for one, 2 to 3 sentences minimum for lecture activity 4. Okay, and finally we have bias for or against change as our last area of perspective. So bias for or against change lacks a balanced perspective on change, and it believes that change is always bad or always good. But the truth is that whether or not change is good or bad depends on the situation. And bias for change is especially popular right now because of technological advancements, right? We've all seen people who get the latest and greatest technology, the newest iPhone or whatever it is, and sometimes the newest technology actually has problems. So maybe it wasn't so great to just run right out and get the newest thing because it is change. And then there is bias against change, which is most likely due to people feeling familiar with certain things or with what they know and not wanting to change or go against what they're familiar with. This can also be the result of the mind is better error or the result of mindless conformity. So to overcome the bias towards change, then you need to monitor your reaction to new ideas. Don't be surprised if you strongly favor or oppose a novel idea. Refuse to accept your first impression without thinking critically. Suspend judgment until you have fully examined the new idea. And finally, don't make judgments based on the newness or oldness of an idea. Okay, so that's it for this chapter. Don't forget to submit the lecture activities and do the assignments that correspond to this week's chapters. Have a good day.